Hello everybody and welcome to the latest webinar in our series entitled Working in Australia. The topic for today that we're going to spend a bit of time on I've called Pay Compliance, Wage Theft and HR Risks, and we'll cover sort of each of those things in turn. It's one of those sessions that could cover a whole host of different things. I've picked a few areas out that I think are important. Some of you may have heard me speak on some of these things before because I have included some components in other sessions, but I want to go into a bit more detail on one or two of them today. I can see there's a reasonable number of people logged in. I hope you can all hear me well, but I think I'll get started. So in terms of contents, these are the things that I really want to focus a bit of time on today. Statutory payroll compliance, really superannuation and payroll tax tend to be relatively hot topics at the moment. Award and EBA compliance is a mammoth topic, to be quite honest with you, that we could spend a whole heap of time on. I'm going to cover some areas of it in a little bit of detail, but I'm sure you'll realize that to cover the entire gambit that might be covered under those things will be pretty difficult, but we'll see what we can do. And then I'll spend a bit of time on some HR risks, which are really problems that fall out of the first two topics, if I'm honest. So we'll talk about some of the problems and some of the focus areas as a consequence of that. A little bit of housekeeping. I think many of you will have heard this before. I'm hopeful you can all hear me reasonably well. What will happen is I'll work through the slide pack today. There's an opportunity in the system for you to pose questions as we go. What we find with these things are some of those questions I can deal with really well in these sessions. Some of them require more specific information, more of a one-to-one conversation. So my intent is I will deal with questions as we go or towards the end. But if I don't respond to your question, I will reach out separately and we can connect and try and deal with it if I feel like I need a bit more information. As I probably said, I think I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, that sort of time frame. I think it's probably in your diaries for an hour and a half. We won't fill that whole time, I don't think, and we will leave some time for questions, as I said. Once this is done, you will get a copy of the slide pack to refer to, and you'll also get, should you want it, a recording of the session, more relevant perhaps for people that have registered but are unable to attend. The slide pack, as you'll see, has all my contact details there as well, so you can get in touch that way too. There we go. As promised, that's my contact details there. You will get them when we email them to you as well. I know in some of these sessions we've had 2 or 3 presenters. Today will be a solo activity, which might make it a little bit shorter. We'll just see how we go. Very good. So the first of my 3 subtopics I want to spend a bit of time on, as I mentioned, statutory payroll compliance, a phrase that could obviously mean a lot of things. But what I wanted to do is pick out 1 or 2 areas in particular that we see issues, problems, challenges, activity, and I've talked about a couple of these before, but they are relevant. They have been relevant for a while, and they continue to be. They'll be relevant for a long time into the future. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on. So superannuation compliance is something that the ATO are heavily focused on. So they quite rightly believe it's important that employers pay the right amount of superannuation for their employees. You're probably all aware that we've seen a small increase in the amount of super to be paid from July 1, and that is going to continue to go up, and it's obviously an area of great focus economically, socially, for a whole host of reasons. It's incredibly important that employers do the right thing. Easy said, not necessarily easy to do. So a little bit of recent history, probably worth covering off on. The government effectively put in place an amnesty for organisations who had not been able to do it completely the right thing from a super perspective. They said, look, if you've made errors or you've had issues in the past with superannuation, we're going to give you this window of opportunity to make good on those things, and that really means paying the ATO amounts that should have been paid to employees so that they can distribute them appropriately to superannuation funds. And what they said was that amnesty would be in place until September of last year, which feels like an awful long time ago now. And during that period, there would be there'd still be an interest charge, but there'd be no admin fee and there'd be no penalties attached with them utilising the amnesty on a voluntary basis. What they also said at that time, and this is quite important, they said that once the amnesty, what the legislation said, once the amnesty is completed, then there will be an uptick an increase in focus on superannuation compliance, and there was provision in the legislation for penalties of up to 200% of the super that had gone incorrectly unpaid. So if you did some work and figured out you owed $100,000 of super that hadn't been paid and should have been, potentially you could expect up to $200,000 of penalties on top of the super and the interest and the admin charge, which obviously is pretty dramatic and pretty problematic if you do get hit with those penalties. Now, as I said, the amnesty ran out in September, and while a number of quite a few organisations did take advantage of the amnesty provisions, it was smack bang in the middle of COVID, as we sort of still are, obviously, but a lot of organisations were going through the existential view of, were they going to survive and be viable through COVID and post-COVID, and remediation of super all of a sudden was not the priority I think the government hoped it would be. So the ATO and the government recognised that the timing was a little bit problematic, and they said, well, the amnesty period's over now, and we said we were going to go hard on this once the amnesty period ended. But we understand COVID has changed priorities for the economy, for everybody. We perhaps will be a little bit more generous around penalties in particular, but only on the basis that you do self-disclose, even though the amnesty period is finished, or voluntarily disclose. And they sort of said that if we do investigate and we find problems, then there'll still be penalties, and you could expect to be treated pretty reasonably harshly nonetheless. So amnesty period over, a little window left open by the government to say, if you do come forward and voluntarily disclose any concerns and make payments, then we'll be reasonably understanding as far as penalties and those sorts of things go. What we've seen is that a number of organisations have done that. They've come through COVID and gone, well, we do want to make good on some of these things, so we do get asked quite frequently by clients to help with the identification and remediation activity that goes along with making good, if you like. And what I've put on this slide here is a few common areas that we see employers sometimes coming unstuck. And none of them are super surprising, I don't think. And they all really sit around either misunderstanding of the legislation or incorrect coding or configuration of wage codes in payroll. So bonuses is a really common confusion. A lot of people form a view that a bonus doesn't relate to your ordinary time earnings. Your salary does, but your bonus doesn't, and that's incorrect. The ATO's view is that if you get a bonus for work that you've done between 9 and 5, then it's OTE in the same way as your salary is. So broadly speaking, should have super attached to it. A few potential exceptions to that, but very few. If you pay a bonus solely with relation to work that was done during overtime outside of normal working hours, then given that that doesn't relate to ordinary time work and ordinary time earnings, then arguably that would be not superable. But I'm not sure I've ever seen an organisation pay a bonus that just relates to overtime activity and not to normal time activity. I think that would be pretty unusual. So for the most part, bonuses are going to get caught, and it's a common mistake, a common error that gets made either as a consequence of poor understanding or poor config, as I said, in the payroll system. So that's certainly one to watch out for. Leave loading is another one that's a little bit confusing. Leave loading effectively used to say that you got a loading on your salary when you took leave to account for the fact that while you were on leave, you didn't have the opportunity to do overtime, but sort of morphed over time into a more common benefit that was paid amount that was paid to people who wouldn't have worked overtime anyway, and then would have had no opportunity to work overtime. So in some circumstances, leave loading would be superable. In some circumstances, it wouldn't be, depending on whether it genuinely related to the loss of potential overtime or not, given the individual and the role in the organisation. Now, helpfully, the ATO's guidance on this has been very poor historically, and they pretty much put their hands up in 2019 and said, look, we haven't advised very well on this in the past, and we've clarified our position now to be as I've just laid it out. So I think they understand that they haven't helped matters on this one. They said at that time that if you were reasonably comfortable with the positions you've taken and could justify them, they certainly weren't going to spend too much time on compliance activities associated to leave loading in particular, given that they caused a bit of confusion there. In the scheme of things, we're generally not talking about huge numbers. That's all well and good, but if you're doing a remediation activity that includes leave loading and other things, then you do have to think about it. The other thing that we see really commonly is payroll codes having been set up historically for specific reasons, but those reasons have sort of disappeared over the course of time. So we see quite a few organizations that still have general or miscellaneous pay codes that they use for things that they don't have another home for in payroll, that they're not sure where else to put, or that it's just easier that way given their payroll system. And the risk you run there is if a general or miscellaneous pay code was set up for a specific reason 5, 6, 7 years ago and was configured correctly at that time for that purpose as being not superable, if the use or purpose or intent of that code has morphed over time to be something that would be OT and would be subject to super, then you run the risk of sort of, making an error without really considering it too much, sort of doing what we've always done, but for slightly different reasons can lead to an error as well. So there are a few particular organizations that absolutely knew that something should have been subject to super, but for whatever reason, or a flag or a code perhaps missed in payroll that means it's just not been set up properly, which can sometimes just lead to errors with the best of intentions. So we quite frequently even now get asked to review this and to give consideration to these sorts of issues. So the approach we'd normally take, and one I recommend you take, and there's no reason why you can't be doing this as part of normal work if you are responsible for payroll, is just to look at the codes that you use frequently. Look at how they're configured in your payroll system. Hopefully you can run a report, or your payroll provider can run a report and tell you which pay codes are set up with a flag and which one isn't. I suspect there might be a couple of sound problems going on, and I think my webcam maybe has stopped. I'm going to carry on and hope that we get a connection back. I hope you can all still hear me. I can see a couple of things happening. I can see myself again at least. I will blunder on and see where we get to. So the point I was making is that looking at the configuration of your pay codes in payroll, just to check which ones are configured as superable and which ones are not, and then going through and assessing whether that's correct. So if you can run a report from payroll that says how they're configured, and you can, or you can ask your payroll provider to do the same thing, you can then go and tick and bash, or we can go and tick and bash for you. Are all these pay codes that are flagged as superable actually OTE? Are these ones that aren't flagged as superable actually not OTE? And what we tend to find when we do the activities, we drill down into 2 or 3 or 4 that have been, for whatever reason, configured incorrectly, or we drill down into 2 or 3 or 4 where the use and intent and purpose of those pay codes isn't clear, and then we can focus in on those ones and determine whether there's an issue. If there is an issue, then the next step would be to look at how those pay codes have been used. Obviously, if you've had big numbers running through specific pay roads that are coded incorrectly, that could be problematic. And you probably want to do some remediation work there. And that can sort of go both ways, right? So you could have pay codes that should be superable but haven't been. That's a problem. You've probably underpaid super for your employees, and you're probably going to want to remedy that. But the other way it's possible too. You could have been paying super, and we see this a fair bit as well. You're paying super on codes where you don't need to, maybe overtime codes or whatever it might be. And you might also want to think about what to do with those overpayments. It's a slightly tricky one because it's payments on codes, super payments on codes that you don't necessarily need to make, but perhaps employees have got used to receiving. So making a change there is something that you've got to think through from a broader than just payroll perspective, because it is going to impact people's super balances, and there's probably some comms that you need to do if you are making overpayments and you think you might change that. From an underpayment perspective, there's a very clear process at the ATO layout to make a disclosure and to do the SGC remediation steps that you have to do. You effectively have to report underpayments quarterly, add the interest and admin charge to that, submit all that to the ATO, pay them the money, they will then distribute it, and they will come back to you around penalties and those sorts of things. So how you go about that, how you structure that, how you voluntarily disclose, how you manage and mitigate penalties, and how you deal with employee comms is something to be thought about through that entire process. A question that comes up quite a bit is how far do you have to go back? And this is a really tricky one because there isn't any statute of limitation on superannuation. So an employee, if they've worked with you for 20 years, could absolutely ask for underpaid super for the last 20 years. When we see the ATO investigate these sorts of things, they tend to go back 5 years. And that seems to be where they cut things off. So often we'll do a review for the past 5 years. But even then, you need to be aware that if you've had employees that have been with you for longer than that time, and there's historical issues that go past beyond 5 years, then they absolutely have the right to come back and say, look, you still owe me super for the last 10, 15 years, whatever it might be. So there's a bit of a balance to be struck there as well, and a bit of an open and honest dialogue that needs to happen. If your staff turnover is high, then it's not such a big deal. But if you have lots of long-term employees, then you really need to think about how far you go back and make right if you do find errors. So that's my first piece. Superannuation, configuration, payroll, and remediation steps are really important things to consider. I think as we come out of COVID, we will see increased activity from the ATO. We see some now. I can tell you with complete confidence that you will be better treated from a penalty perspective if you voluntarily disclose these things than if you don't and the ATO choose to audit and they find issues and problems. It's a much more difficult conversation around penalties if they find the issue rather than organisations disclosing themselves. So I'm going to move on to payroll tax and SRO audits. And look, it's not the most complicated thing in the world. The reason I've put it in here is that there's a lot of activity in this space at the moment. I think what's happening, with the ATO, with the SRO, and lots of other bodies as well, is there's been a revenue loss, of course, given COVID, and the government have spent a lot of money they didn't intend to spend on JobKeeper and all those sorts of things. So I think there is a focus now on revenue leakage or revenue gaps that authorities want to fill. And what we're seeing, certainly from a Victorian SRO perspective, is that they are starting to issue audits into payroll tax where they hint that there might be an issue or concern. They're not super targeted, is my experience. They tend to be pretty broad brush, so they'll ask for almost everything where they think there might be a problem. And the challenge with that is that even if there isn't a problem where they think there might be one, you still have to go through the whole process, and there is potential for them to find concerns elsewhere. And it's quite a difficult thing to get 100% right 100% of the time, as a lot of this stuff is. So there could be some challenges there. The other thing we're aware of is that and this is a recurring theme, I think, is that the tax offices, state, federal, and other bodies as well, Fair Work, Border Force, and a whole host of others, are pretty well connected these days. So they do a lot of data matching in an automated fashion, and I think they do a fair bit of data sharing in a non-automated fashion as well. So it's been really common for a long time for if you're under payroll tax audit in one state and you have activities in the other states, you can expect audits in those other states as well. But also, I think sharing between SRO and ATO is more common and prevalent as well. So there's a whole host of ways that these things might kick up. And once they do, they can just take a bit of work to work through. So I've listed here some of the common areas that we see SRO focused on from a payroll tax perspective. Contractors is a really common one. I won't spend a heap of time on it, but contractors present a few different challenges. The first one is, well, just because you've called somebody a contractor, are they really a contractor? Are they actually an employee masquerading as a contractor? And there's a whole host of tests that you sort of have to apply on a case-by-case basis there to really decide whether someone who you're calling a contractor who's calling themselves a contractor actually is, or should they really be an employee. And this sort of sham contracting arrangement is something that we'll come back to because it's a focus further on in the slide pack as well. Even once you've determined that somebody is appropriately and correctly a contractor, not an employee, you're then not necessarily entirely out of the woods from a payroll tax perspective. You've then got to determine whether there's an exemption available to get those contractor payments out of payroll tax. And while there are a broad range of exemptions available, largely depending on what the individual does and how long they do it for your organization and or how long your organization requires those sorts of services, there is still a bit of work to do to determine that contractors should be exempt from payroll tax. And it should really be done, I think, when you take contractors on, that sort of analysis around, well, are they really a contractor? And if they are, do we think we're going to be able to exempt them from payroll tax? And then when you do your payroll tax reconciliations at year end, it's something you need to look at again to go, well, these are the people we thought. wouldn't be payroll taxable. Does that still hold true now that the year's passed and we can see what they've been doing and how long they've been doing it for? So contractors presents a whole host of issues, not just in the payroll tax space, but that is one area that we see the SRO focusing on at the moment. FBT is a really common one. You know, they have access to, this is a good example of data sharing. They have access to FBT records as well. So the SRO just checking that fringe benefits have been brought to account appropriately for payroll tax purposes is a common question that they'll ask. So you can sort of expect to see that. Regional payroll tax rates is one that comes up from time to time, and it's an interesting one because obviously there are some regional reductions of payroll tax rates that are available. What we've seen in this space is that these rules, although they're not super complicated, they have changed a little bit recently, and the SRO operatives don't necessarily understand them all that well either. So we've seen a couple of cases where the SRO have said, you've claimed the regional rate reduction, we don't think you're entitled to it. And then when you work through the process, they absolutely are entitled to it. And the SRO sort of go, oh, okay, yeah, sorry, we made a mistake, that kind of thing. And that's fine. The problem is at that point, they've opened an audit and they're going to look at everything else too. So even though you might be able to tick the box on that one, which was their original prompt, you've then got to go through the process with all the other areas. And as I said, it's pretty difficult to get all of this right all of the time. Expats is one that might not impact all of you, but if you have people inbound and people outbound, just making sure you're considering those guys appropriately for payroll tax as well is quite important. If you have people who are paid offshore but work in your business, are you doing the right things by those guys, particularly if they're around for longer than 6 months? Equally, if people leave your business to go work for a related entity somewhere else or overseas, then you just need to think about whether you can take them off the payroll tax list as well. So just getting that cohort of people right is quite important too. So really steps to consider there. The annual reconciliation process, I think I've already mentioned, is really important. It's very difficult to do if your record keeping isn't up to scratch. What we find a lot is that some of these payroll tax audits, and particularly in that contractor space, you end up trawling through lots and lots of handwritten invoices to try and determine whether someone is doing a contractor's work or doing an employee's work, and if so, how much and for how long. And sometimes there's no avoiding that, but making sure at least your record keeping is such that you've got access to all consistent, easily managed fashion is important. From an onboarding perspective as well, making sure that you're going through a process at the onboarding stage to decide whether someone genuinely is a contractor or an employee is really important as well. And I think if you do that when you bring people on and your annual reconciliation process is good and you keep good records, although it's cumbersome and time consuming, it means you're going to get close to the right answer every time. And it also means that you're going to deal efficiently with any audit that does happen. And my experience with audits with SRO and ATO is that the more efficiently you can deal with them, and this is similar to the last point actually on superannuation, the more efficiently and effectively you can deal with them, and the better rapport you can build up with the investigator, the more likely you are to have success with them minimizing, managing, mitigating any penalties and ongoing audit activity. So I think being ready and prepared for those things is quite important, and then not ignoring them when they do pop up, I think is really important as well. So I'm going to carry on to the next piece of my presentation here. I'm a little bit concerned about the connectivity. I hope that you can all hear me okay, but I will carry on. So award and EBA compliance, wage theft is what I want to spend a little bit of time on now. There's a few things to this. So I don't really like the term wage theft. It was a term that was thrown around heavily in the press pre-COVID, really. There's obviously lots of the media get quite excited by that sort of language. It has political connotations as well. And the going in assumption from that perspective was that anyone that was underpaying staff was doing it maliciously and deliberately and was stealing money from employees. And what sort of transpired and what continues to transpire is that is often, predominantly, I would say, not the case at all. That being said, while it's not an active theft, in my opinion, for the most part, it is something that needs to be dealt with, right? So what's become apparent, and the press have sort of realized this as well, I think, is that the landscape, the IRA landscape is so complicated that it's very, very easy for organizations to make good faith mistakes in this area and underpay employees without knowing about it. And while they would say, well, that's no defense, you need to know the rules and understand them, I think there is a growing acceptance that it's complicated, it's difficult to get right. And what that means is, probably from your perspective, is it takes more time and work than people anticipated to get this right and keep it right. Again, and we'll cover this in a bit more detail, COVID has sort of taken the spotlight off this a little bit. But there's still plenty of activity happening. There's still plenty of investigations and audits happening. And I think as we emerge, hopefully with a strong economy over the next few months post-COVID, I think we'll see this become really important again. Wage growth obviously is a concern for the economy, and I think anything that suggests employers aren't getting the right amount of money in the hands of their employees is going to continue to be high focus, and we'll cover a couple pieces of evidence for that thinking as we go on. So I've sort of put on this slide 3 areas that we see over the last 18 months to 2 years, the sort of investigation remediation work we've been involved in. 3 sort of areas that is focused on really, and that's because over time, over the last little bit, that's where the Fair Work Ombudsman has focused, and that's where the issues have been. So hospitality was early on in the piece was a real big focus area. What became clear is that the way restaurants in particular operated did not align well to the award. Annual hours contracts were a real problem, where they might pay someone $60,000 to do 45 hours a week of work, and that would be okay. That might even overpay them slightly against the award, but actually culturally, or the way those hospitality organizations actually operate, is that people don't work those hours. They work 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week because that's what they do, and that's how the entire industry operates. And all of a sudden, those annual hours contract amounts don't cover what individuals should have been paid for the actual hours that they worked. So the challenge was annual hours contracts felt competitive because that's what everyone else was doing. Annual hours contracts were being given to chefs, for example, and that was okay until somebody realized that actually those people were working way more hours than the annual hours contract sort of covered, and that's sort of what started this ball rolling. And I think I think there are lots of there are lots of good, well-publicized examples of restaurants and high-profile restaurants and chefs who have struggled or even gone under as a consequence of not getting this right. It can snowball really quickly. So restaurants was a big focus area for that reason, but it also bleeds into other hospitality organizations as well. Hotels have similar challenges, more complex in some ways because they have more workers doing a broader variety of roles. The same goes for resorts or resort operators or stadium operators or whatever it might be. There's a real challenge there, which I think is well known and understood now, but certainly 18 months or 2 years ago, it perhaps wasn't. So hospitality, a real focus area, and we've done a lot of work in the remediation, the recalculation effectively, understanding where it's gone wrong, what's gone wrong, and how much has gone wrong by it, and then going through the remediation process, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Retail, sort of similar. Doesn't necessarily give the same problems because retail tends to be more standard hours, tends to be a more 9 to 5 sort of industry. Okay, there'll be some overtime, some weekends, some early starts, perhaps some late finishes around holidays or Christmas time, but a bit more predictable. Whereas hotels and restaurants could be 24 hours or could be, go till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So the retail problem has more been around just poor understanding of award rates and poor record keeping. Who's worked breaks at what time, the awards specify when employees are required to have a break. Have they had that break? Who knows? Has it been recorded? Often, who knows? So often what you see there is technical breaches of the award because you can't prove that those breaks have been taken, for example. That can be problematic. Even if you've actually paid people appropriately, you may still have breached award terms and conditions there. And understanding classification, as I mentioned, people change roles in retail, and as they move up, as they get more responsibility, have they been classified appropriately under the award or EBA if you have one, to make sure they're still being paid appropriately, can be problematic. And just general poor record keeping around start times and end times, as I said, those things can drive problems in retail. The other area where we've seen a lot of work in this space is in the not-for-profit sector, which is a big catch-all for a huge number of organizations. But if I try and pull some themes out of that one, not-for-profits operate then often not 9 to 5 organizations. They might be providing support or care, whether it's aged care or disability or mental health, whatever it might be. It's not a 9-to-5 gig. So they could very well have people working around the clock. They could have people working for 2 hours between 12 and 2 in the morning on like an on-call recall arrangement. They could have people doing sleepovers at clients' houses because they provide support during the night. There's a whole range of unusual work patterns that are really common in the not-for-profit sector as a consequence of just the work that those organizations do. And what compounds the challenge here, there's a couple things. One we see is that traditionally the not-for-profit sector is not a particularly highly paid sector, so there isn't much of a buffer really for a lot of organizations between what the award or EBA might say and what's actually paid. The other things that we see that are really problematic is that the technology and the processes have not been focused on sufficiently. Not-for-profits by their nature tend to be mission-driven and mission-led, and they plow everything back into the great work that they do with their clients or for the community, and not so much necessarily historically into automated processes or efficient processes or training around rostering or time and attendance or implementation of time and attendance and payroll systems, or whatever it might be, which can lead to just difficulty in having confidence as to whether people are being paid properly. We do a lot of work in the space where we end up trawling through, to be honest, poorly completed paper timesheets, which are then passed to payroll in the hope that payroll can decipher and understand what an individual might have done over a week and pay them accordingly and appropriately. And there's just such a wide potential for error from the beginning of that process, the rostering process, all the way through to the pay process. It can very easily lead to people not being paid the appropriate wages or allowances that they should be, and also perhaps not being given the right amount of time off or gaps between shifts or whatever it might be. So the not-for-profit is a real problematic area in this space. It's not one that I think that Fair Work are over-focused on, but absolutely we do see investigations in this space driven by complaints from employees and former employees. So it is one that's important to get right. And actually it can be quite time consuming. The SHADS award in particular is a challenging one. EBAs built around the social care awards are complicated for the reasons I've mentioned, so it's a real difficult area. So at the bottom of the slide, I've just highlighted, I think I've probably touched on most of these things. Problem areas sit around classification of roles under awards, people changing roles or getting promoted. What related really is how contracts are drawn up, and do they have the appropriate language in them to perhaps allow offsetting of one payment against another? Do they accurately reflect what people are doing? Breaks is an important one. All the awards really specify breaks and when they should be taken, 4 hours into a shift, whatever it might be. Record keeping around breaks is a challenge, so making sure there's some real clear understanding on the shop floor, if you like, around those sorts of things, so that at least if there's not detailed recording necessarily, there's clear policy and process around when breaks are taken and those sorts of things. Unpaid overtime is a real common one. I mentioned sleepovers previously, and handwritten timesheets. Those sorts of things can be a problem as well. I just pause there for a second. There's a good chance you can hear my dog in the background going crazy. I would say it's the postman. I apologize. I'm going to move us on a little bit to just look at a bit more detail at Fair Work's role in all of this. So I've sort of given you a flavor or a picture of sort of the challenges in this space. What we see is that Fair Work are increasingly involved and invested in this area. I think if you go back 3 or 4 years, this wasn't really an issue on anyone's radar, in all honesty. I'm sure Fair Work were doing good work at that time, but it certainly didn't have the press attention, the media attention, the political attention that it does now. So Fair Work have really stepped into the limelight over the last 2 or 3 years, and they do conduct a lot of audits. And in half of those audits, they find issues of underpayment or at very least incorrect record keeping, which is a pretty high hit rate in my opinion. Now, there's a few things around this. One is that there's a question around what drives the Fair Work to commence these audits. And it could be part of their regular work, and they do have a regular plan, which we'll come on to. But it could just as easily be as a consequence of a single complaint. So if one employee says, oh, I was worked too hard at that organization, they didn't pay me what they should have paid me, then you really run the risk of Fair Work opening an investigation. And that could come from, as I say, an individual, perhaps a former disgruntled employee, perhaps an employee with genuine concern. That employee may not go straight to you, they may not go straight to Fair Work, they might go to the union, they might go to the press. There's a real challenge around how these things kick off. And I think if you're in an environment where your employees are uncomfortable coming to you and saying, I'm not sure I'm being paid right, then you run a risk of them going somewhere else. So that sort of disgruntled or current or former employee who feels like they've been not paid properly for whatever reason can trigger audit activity in the space, as can, again, data sharing and data matching. I mentioned this is happening more and more. I think if an example might be if Border Force have a view that migrant workers aren't being paid properly in an organization or in an industry, then that can absolutely filter through to Fair Work, who may also decide to investigate a similar sort of an issue that's been identified in perhaps an entirely different way, a complaint to Border Force or the Immigration Department or whatever it might be. So there's a whole host of ways whereby that audit activity can commence. And again, similar to what I was saying before about the State Revenue Office, once an audit activity commences, they can be quite all-encompassing. That the volume of data that Fair Work might want to see and review can be pretty horrific, actually. And if you've got really good time and attendance and contract and pay data records, then that's maybe okay. But if you've got lots of casual workforce who only worked at certain times because they got an email from a manager that said, can you come in and do this shift, and they did, and then they got paid for it, the Fair Work could absolutely want that evidence of when did they come in, why did they come in, what prompted them to come in, did they really work 3 hours, or did they actually was their job a 5-hour job? And they can get quite granular in the information that they want. And what we've seen so far is that they are on the side of asking for everything, which can create a massive sort of forensic challenge around, well, how do we pull all that data out? Where is it? Do we have it? How do we get it? Big organizations with lots of people in lots of different departments, where those departments or business lines might have different processes and systems, can add to that challenge. Highly casualized workforce, where you might have a large number of people working small number of hours, obviously creates a huge amount of data as well. So I think once you're in Fair Work audit world, it can really, for a lot of organizations, be quite challenging just to pull that data together and make sure that you can present it in a way, even if you've got no actual issues, even if there's nothing there to hide at all, just the process that can be very, very time consuming. If I skip ahead a little bit to a process that Fair Work might go through, and let's say for the sake of argument that they do find some challenges, some underpaid employees, then obviously they're going to look to you to remediate that and to make those payments that haven't been made correctly and appropriately. That they're also almost certainly going to apply penalties. They're almost certainly going to issue what's generally called an enforceable undertaking, and this is at the end of the process. You commit to paying your people correctly in the future, and it says a whole host of other things. And generally speaking, it also says you commit to having this issue audited in 12 months and 24 months time. And we see things like the FRO saying, Fair Work Ombudsman saying, we expect you to have an external independent audit done of 25% of your staff to make sure they're being paid appropriately in 12 months and in 24 months. And once that audit's done, you need to have whoever does the independent audit send the results directly to us at Fair Work rather than to you, the client or the organization, so that they can see that it's truly independent and be made aware that there are no future and ongoing issues. So if you end up in the enforceable undertaking world and having to do 2 years worth of audits on things that you think you fixed and pay somebody to do them and not even see the results until Fair Work have them, that's a lot of work and a lot of hassle that you want to avoid if possible, right? So I think getting this right and reducing the risk of any audit activity is really important for a whole host of reasons, but that is absolutely one of them. So I've reproduced on this slide, I think you can see the just one page from a little while ago now from the Fair Work Ombudsman's website. They're not shy, it's fair to say, about sharing their successes you see in the press quite frequently. They're pretty, pretty robust in reporting and externally reporting issues that they find. And obviously, it doesn't take a genius to realise that the reputational damage that can do is also quite problematic. So you do see these things pop up in the press for lots of people. And obviously there's reputational risk and damage there, which is something we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. So I pulled this from, this is something relatively new that Fair Work have publicised quite recently, and it still relates to audit activity. So the picture on the right there is effectively what they've determined their Fair Work's compliance activities, priorities, to be in 21-22. And it looks quite neat and tidy. It's quite a nice little picture, but actually when you read through it, you realise it's pretty broad. So while they've started off saying that their priority is supporting workplaces as they recover from COVID, and I think there's some truth in that, right? They're not trying to kick people when they're down necessarily. That's not going to stop them from investigating and dealing with organisations who maybe haven't done the right thing. So they've identified some priority sectors there. I think you can see fast food and restaurants, horticulture, sham contracting, which we'll talk about in a second, contract cleaning, franchise arrangements, and large corporate underpayments. And then underneath those 6 things, they've also said they've got an enduring commitment to prioritise small business employers and employees and vulnerable workers. So in my perhaps slightly cynical mind, if you're going to focus on large corporates and you're going to focus on small businesses, you pretty much caught everybody that they're going to focus on. Obviously, in particular, it sounds like it's going to be fast food and restaurants and cafes, horticulture, etc., but it's a pretty broad net that they've laid out for themselves there to continue to focus on. And as I said, you see more and more, maybe I'll look out for it more, but I see more and more from Fair Work where they're demonstrating that this is actually what they're doing. And you can see at the bottom, it's a little bit small, they're also going to focus on public interest, blatant disregard, significant scale or impact on workers or communities as areas as well. So, they're going to keep pushing hard, I think is the messaging here. So I don't think anyone's necessarily going to be immune from focus and spotlight when it comes to paying employees what they should be paid under award and EBA, which is what as a society I think we should expect. But it's important that I think we're aware of it. Sham contracting, I think I touched on before, and sham contracting is specific Fair Work language, but we're talking about the same thing as I mentioned earlier, right? Just because someone's called a contractor doesn't necessarily make them a contractor. It's very much a form of a substance approach there. And actually what the Fair Work and ATO do is they look at the substance of the matter. They don't really care about the form so much. So just because you've got a contract that says a contractor, well, that's what's happened previously, it doesn't necessarily mean they are. You've got to look at what that individual's doing, how they're doing it, who's taking responsibility for it, are they able to delegate it, can they use their own tools, can they come and go as they please to get a specific job done, or actually are they just doing a job that an employee absolutely could be doing, and you may even have other employees doing a similar thing. I think you've got to be really careful with employee versus contractor distinction, because obviously if you've got someone as a contractor, maybe they don't fall into an award or an EBA, but actually if they're called a contractor but really they're an employee, then they are likely to fall into an award or an EBA, and then you've got a whole host of issues around are you paying them the right amounts, aside from the other issues that we sort of mentioned, payroll tax and possibly leave entitlements and all of those sorts of things as well. So I think there's a whole host of reasons why being really clear about your employee versus contractor distinction and staying on top of that is really important, be it a tax or a leave or a Fair Work concern. I think we're going to see a lot more activity in this space as time goes on, and I think you see it in the press as well more and more, where organisations that have set themselves up as being contractor based aren't necessarily winning their cases in court anymore, where individuals are saying we think we're employees, not contractors. And I'm talking about the rideshare or the food delivery sort of organisations that bring in this into sharper contrast, not just here, all over the world. And certainly there are cases in the UK more than here that are finding more and more of those sorts of individuals to actually be employees and entitled to employee sort of treatment. And we're seeing that here as well, and I think that's going to continue to follow. So I think understanding those things is really important. Now, I'm just checking the time. I'm cognizant that I've talked for quite a while. The other thing I wanted to touch on that is similar, quite similar, but presents another level of complexity around making sure you're paying people properly, is the Victorian Wage Theft Act that has come in with great, reasonable amount of fanfare and press quite recently. So very, very recently, there's been a commissioner appointed to effectively deal with enforcement of the Wage Theft Act for Victoria. And what the Act sort of says is that they're focused very much on deliberate and dishonest activity. So if you know the rules but don't care, you're still going to pay people $12 an hour, and that's how you're going to roll, then this is where the Victorian legislation is really heavily focused. And I've just pulled this, as you can see, from their website, that sort of is very clear that from 1 July 2021, it's a crime to do these things, to deliberately underpay, dishonestly withhold wages and superannuation, etc., etc. Now, obviously, proving deliberate and dishonest is a matter for the lawyers, perhaps in the audience or elsewhere. But I think it does show the increased interest that the states are going to have, as well as the Commonwealth, around wage theft, for want of a better phrase. And you can see there as well that there's some pretty scary wording around these crimes are punishable by a fine of up to $218,000, 10 years in jail for individuals, and $1 million for companies. You can see that the legislation, the posturing, the messaging is that this is going to be taken very seriously. Now, how this plays out, I think, certainly I haven't seen it happen yet. Obviously, this is very, very new, given this is 1 July 2021 and there's been other things going on. How this actually happens, it's going to be interesting to see how investigations are conducted, how the interaction happens with Fair Work Ombudsman, at what point the Victorian Commissioner becomes interested because he suspects wage theft rather than accidental honest mistake, is going to be interesting as well. So it's a very much a watch this space on this one, but I think it just highlights the increased focus that we're going to see on pay compliance and wage compliance over the next little while. So I can imagine in 6 to 12 months' time we might do another session on this once we've seen the Victorian Wage Inspectorate sort of in action and in practice. It's going to be interesting to see how much additional audit type activity that generates. And if anyone's had experience, I'd be interested to hear. I know it's very early days, but it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, I think. A couple of things I was going to touch on very, very quickly here. I know it's a lot of context and time is sort of getting away. I think these things are pretty well documented, and certainly I've spoken about them before. Annualized salaries, we saw some changes to awards over a year ago now that required much more conscientious record keeping around the annual hours of people in certain awards who would otherwise be on a 9 to 5 sort of a contract. There has to be, the clerk's award is a really common one here, where you might have someone on a 9 to 5 contract who doesn't necessarily record the comings and goings because they work 9 to 5 or thereabouts. They're paid an amount and that's the end of it. You've now got to be much more diligent about recording how much time they work, and much more diligent in explaining in your engagement with those people what amount, if any, of overtime their pay, their salary is designed to cover. And then if you do go outside of that, then there's a requirement to pay them overtime. And I think the other important thing here is that there's a requirement under the awards that have dropped this language in, that there needs to be an annual reconciliation done every 12 months to make sure that you are doing the things you're supposed to do. Now, the challenges here are quite a few. Probably haven't come to the fore necessarily because of COVID, but I think where there were previously no issues with someone working 9 to 5 on an annual hours contract who didn't do much overtime and did a good job, they may now have to record their comings and goings and their breaks and those things, which in a lot of industries can be a pain. Culturally, it's not ideal if all of a sudden you've got to set up systems that effectively track your employees more than you did before. So the systems there, the comms there are quite challenging. And then the annual reconciliation obligation too means that even if you know you haven't got a problem, you still got to do some work to sort of justify that each year. Rosato, I'm not really going to spend any time on here. It relates to the classification of casual employees who are getting a casual loading as actually not really being casual employees and being entitled to leave entitlements in addition to the loading that they got. problematic from a government perspective and an organisation perspective, because it meant that there was potential for unaccounted for obligations for historical leave entitlements that hadn't been taken into account before. Now, there was a legislative change made as a consequence that allowed an offsetting of a casual employee's casual loading in the event that there should have been any leave entitlement paid out previously. There's an appeal going through court as well with respect to Rosata, which I don't think has a judgment been handed down on. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think the legislative change around allowing the offset of the casual loading sort of minimises and mitigates the risk in almost all cases here, but I think it will evolve. It's a bit of a watch this space on that one as well. I think there was a fair bit of panic when the judgment was handed down, and then the legislative change to a degree has eased that panic. There's a constitutional question floating around about whether a retrospective change is constitutional there, and I think all that still needs to wash through for us to really understand the implications of it. So what does all that mean? I think there's a lot to consider there, from a award and EBA compliance wage theft perspective, and I've dot pointed a few things here. I think doing some sort of periodic review so you can satisfy yourself that you are doing the right things and there aren't mistakes slipping through with your workforce is really quite important. Your directors, your board should probably be asking these sorts of questions. If they're not now, they will do soon. Given all the press from other organizations that was tripping up in this space, it sort of makes sense that they are. So perhaps it is something that should be in your work plan, whether it's an internal audit work plan or a standalone activity done once every year on a sample basis or a couple of years or whatever it might be. I think doing the work to make sure that you are compliant is really important. And if you do find issues or errors, correcting them, remediating any historical underpayments and fixing processes going forward so that they don't happen again is really important as well. I think it's going to be increasing. I think, as we've seen, I think that the Fair Work and the Victorian focus on this is going to be ever increasing, and it makes sense to get ahead of the curve. Technology as a consequence is really important there. You know, I think there are some very strong time and attendance and payroll technology solutions out there that record people's time on site using an app or a code or a fingerprint or whatever it might be, and then take that time and attendance information, run it through the award appropriately, run it through payroll correctly so that people are paid the right amount. And as long as all that's set up and configured really well, then there are some good solutions there. So it's a problem that can be solved. It is I think that the fact that not enough organizations have those systems in place, even when they do, they take a lot more setting up and running than people I think anticipate. That means there are still potential gaps there, but it absolutely can be done, and it can be solved with some of the technology that's out there. But it's not sort of a click your fingers and make it happen activity. I think it's a big job if you haven't got an automated time and attendance system in place that speaks to payroll via some sort of award interpreter that's been independently reviewed. Then there's a bit of work there to get that going, and that is also not necessarily going to solve historical problems, right? Because you might set something up that works really well from a technology perspective going forward, but if that's throwing out different results to what you would have seen 1 or 2 years ago, then you've maybe got a remediation problem to deal with there as well. And there's obviously a whole host of employment law considerations in there. I've dot pointed a few of them. I'm not an employment lawyer. What we find is when we do this sort of work, we work quite closely in some cases with employment lawyers, because it just makes sense to deal with interpretation questions and those sorts of things, classification questions, that there's an employment lawyer involved. So it does make sense to have that support. Just checking the time quickly. We're nearly there. So I think HR risks, I'm not going to spend too much time on, because I think hopefully they sort of fall out of everything that we've already said, right? My view is that everything's an HR risk pretty much. Employees in a business bring risk, but employees not in a business mean you probably haven't got very much of a business. So one way or another, all of these things create risks for HR and your people function. And you know, those risks sit around, as we've touched on. I think some of these, at least. Brand and reputational damage is a really obvious one. If you're in the press for $350 million of underpayment of employees, for example, that's not great from a brand and reputational perspective. And I think that can quite quickly drive recruitment and retention issues. You're certainly not, well, you're not necessarily going to be an employer of choice if you've got a history of being in the press for underpaying staff. And likewise, retention can be a challenge there as well, right? If it's an ongoing problem and other organizations in your industry do it better, do it correctly, then that can drive retention issues, and culture issues really sit in amongst that as well. And then there's the burden just of getting this right. I think that we've just touched on the administrative burden that just doing the work, even if you've got no issues, doing the work to prove it takes time. It's a challenging job, but it's a job I think that more and more has to be done. And where you do find problems, I think the unexpected costs can have a real impact on the business. And we've absolutely seen, and we talked about this in the hospitality restaurant sector especially, we've absolutely seen our businesses go under as a consequence of having to back pay salary and just not being able to afford it. And fines and penalties sit on top of that as well, right? So a few things to think about here. All of them we've sort of touched on. Time and attendance system I mentioned just a moment ago. Do you have one? Is it fit for purpose? My guidance would be if you've got 7 different versions of a paper timesheet for different purposes and people are filling them out manually, then somebody else is keying them into a system, but is reliant on understanding that individual's work habits to get the right result through payroll, then I think you've probably got something that you want to look at there. And we see that pretty frequently. And then your payroll solution itself, I think from a award interpretation, but also if you go back to the start of the session, I talked about super and payroll tax. Have I got a payroll system that works, is configured properly, where I can run those reports? I can make sure it's doing the right thing. Is it the right system and solution for us at this point? Any number of times I had these conversations with clients, and what was a fit for purpose payroll system 10 years ago for the size of organization, complexity of the organization at that time, it just isn't at the moment. And while there's been bolt-ons and add-ons and changes along the way, you sort of get to a point where it just isn't necessarily fit for purpose anymore. So is it time to look at that whole payroll solution just to see if it's the right solution for you? Is it time to think about outsourcing? There's a whole host of potential things there. And along with the technology piece, it's really important, I think, to think about the individuals involved. You can have the best technology in the world, but if there's no one around who remembers how to use it properly, then it's not much use to you. So I think having your payroll and your IR or whoever deals with your employee relations or award interpretation, whatever it might be, industrial relations, all of those things, having those teams resourced appropriately and trained appropriately. We see so frequently where we look at payroll functions that there's one individual who knows it inside out and back to front and is fantastic and does a great job and holds the whole thing together. But the risk if that person decides to do something different, retires, moves on, whatever it might be, is hugely problematic, right? All of a sudden you're left in a very difficult position. So having a little bit of strength and depth there, trained appropriately, redundancy in redundancy in terms of making sure there's more than one person that can do the same thing at any given moment, I think is really important, and I think is a real risk. You call an HR, I've called it an HR risk here, and I think it's a real risk whether payroll sits in HR or not. I think it doesn't matter. It's a risk that HR need to think about. And there's a similar thing with line managers there, because it's often line managers who are supporting staff. Two things: supporting staff to complete their timesheets, maybe, and making sure they understand the right way to do that to get the right outcome and answer. But also it's often line managers that are doing the rostering and making sure they've got enough knowledge of the award and EBAs to make sure they're doing that as efficiently as possible. I think is maybe a downstream challenge for a lot of organizations, but it's something that is worth thinking about, because I think the better you do that rostering, the more effective your sort of cash flow is going to be from a people cost perspective. If you have line managers that always roster the same person, their friend perhaps, on those particular shifts that their friend likes, it might not be the most efficient way to staff that particular part of the business, and it might be driving cost up unnecessarily, where maybe somebody else could do that role sufficiently and not already be in overtime world or whatever it might be. So I think there's a few things there as well. I think end to end, they're looking at the processes that cover all those things we've really spoken about are really important and should be in your internal audit or risk review that hopefully you conduct from time to time in this space, and it would uncover quite a few of these things we've mentioned. And my last dot point here relates to M&A activity, because it's something we see quite a lot where if you're involved in buying, acquiring, merging with an organization, you may look really closely at their finances and their clients and all those things that you do in a due diligence as part of an M&A activity, but don't necessarily look closely enough at any embedded exposure or risk associated with the sort of things we've mentioned. If you acquire a business and find that they haven't been paying their employees appropriately for the last 10 years, but you've already acquired them now and you didn't deal with that during the M&A process, and you maybe haven't got warranties to deal with that or whatever it might be, then I think that that's something that during the M&A process you kind of want to think about as well. So that's the hour I maybe said I was going to fill. We talked about questions. There's a few come through. A couple of them I'll try and deal with right now. There's a question come through that relates to, and I only touched on this briefly actually, relates to whether it's necessary to get legal representation with these sorts of underpayment issues. And it's a really good question. So often you think, well, I'm going to engage maybe an accountant to help me deal with this. Do I need to engage a lawyer as well? It depends, but mainly yes would be my advice or my experience on this. And there's a few reasons. What our preference is when we're going to do a review of an organization who suspect they might have an issue in this space, we'd rather be engaged by a lawyer than directly by the client. And that's so we can work under privilege. It enables us to work just a little bit more freely with reduced risk of having to disclose our work if a matter does end up in court. So I think being able to work under privilege is a good reason to involve an employment lawyer early in these things. And the second one I think I mentioned before is any questions of interpretation of award, interpretation of classification. And the more you read the awards and EBAs, the more you realize that there is quite a bit of grey in them. The more it's helpful to get a legal view on some of those things so you can weigh up the balance of probabilities. How would Fair Work or a judge interpret this versus maybe how have we interpreted it in the past and how we're going to interpret it going forward. So while we can absolutely help with that, there are absolutely circumstances where it makes sense with to discuss with an employment lawyer. So I would say for the most part, unless you're really confident that there's no underlying issues, then I think it generally makes sense to involve an employment lawyer in these sorts of remediation investigations early, I'll put it that way. Another question that's come through that relates to the when doing a review of superannuation configuration in payroll, how far back you should go, and it's a good question. I think I touched on it. But the nutshell answer is there isn't really a statute of limitations on underpayment of super, so you could go back to when super started, which is before I came to Australia, but it's a good long time ago. 25 years ago maybe. So obviously you're not going to conduct a review 25 years into the past if you can help it. What we tend to see is where Fair Work investigate underpayments of super, where the HRL investigate underpayments of superannuation, they'll go back 5 years, and that's generally what they'll want to look at. It doesn't mean that's your only window to be concerned about. As I think I said before, if employees have been with you longer than that and they come and knock on your door and say, look, I think super's been underpaid for the last 12 years, then you have an obligation to make good on that if they're correct. An investigation, as I say, 5 years or thereabouts, but just keep in mind that there is no statute there that really shuts the door on it. It's problematic, right? Because who's got records going back that far? Nobody, and you're not required to keep those records necessarily. And that's where there's sort of a bit of friction in this space. So that's sort of my answer on that one. Now, there's a couple of other questions come through, but I think they're going to be best dealt with one-on-one. So I will get back to individuals whose questions I haven't answered one-on-one to deal with them. Which brings me to a close, really. I just want to say thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you found something in it that's been helpful. I'm happy to talk further on any of these topics. You can probably tell I'm quite happy to talk about them. So please do get in touch. This was the last in our scheduled 6 Work in Australia webinars that we put in the diary in January time, I think. What our intention is to get some feedback from participants. They've been pretty well attended for the overall. We've had lots of people attend and lots of feedback. So we're going to go through that feedback and have a think about what the future should look like for these webinars. I think we'll continue to run them perhaps every other month. And I want to focus more on topics that sort of match with the feedback that we get around what people want to hear more on, noting that there are some things that I think in any given year we want to cover FBT at the right time. We want to cover year-end payroll at the right time, but outside of that, I think there's a whole host of things that we could talk about and get the expertise in to talk about in these webinars, and that is what we're going to try and do. So watch the space, and there'll be more to follow. And I think that is it from me. I just want to say thank you once more for attending, and if you have any questions of me or want to discuss any of the content here, then please do get in touch, and I'm happy to talk in more detail. Thanks, folks. Stay safe during lockdown and have a good day. Cheers.